Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The morning Genoa City awoke to Victor Newman's quiet process felt deceptively ordinary, yet beneath the face, everything was formally unraveling. For decades, Victor Newman had ruled the megacity through calculated restraint, striking only when certainty replaced dubitation. This time was no different. What he carried was rumor, not influence but evidence, cold wave, clinical, unrecoverable evidence, commodity that would not simply shake families but fracture individualities. The DNA report sat sealed in his briefcase as Victor entered Newman Enterprises, his stride slow, his eyes fixed forward. He knew precisely what this would bring. He also knew the cost of silence would be lesser. By mid-morning, whispers gurgled through the corridors. An unrestricted door meeting had been called. Victor had requested only 3 people be present, a detail that unsettled everyone who heard it. When Victor limited the followership, the outgrowth was no way small. Phyllis Summers arrived late, vexation fluttering across her face as she tried to mask apprehension with bravado. She had survived dishonors, backstabbings, and near deaths, but commodity about this process eroded at her. Phyllis had always trusted her instincts, and every instinct screamed that the once, her most precisely buried once, was clawing its way to the face. Daniel Romalotti arrived next, awaiting another commercial battle or family disagreement. Daniel had rebuilt his life piece by piece, sculpturing out stability after times of chaos. He believed he'd eventually overrun the murk of his nonage. He was wrong. Victor awaited until the door closed behind them, also placed the envelope on the table, his fritters resting atop it like a judge's gavel. No bone spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, until Victor eventually broke it, not with wrathfulness but with futurity. Victor revealed that months before, an anomaly had surfaced during an unconnected medical exigency, one that refocused to inconsistencies in long-held birth hypotheticals. At first, Victor admitted, he dismissed it as coexistence. But coexistence had a way of demanding attention when ignored. He commissioned independent testing off the books with labs that answered only to him. The results were amicable. The man Daniel had believed was his natural father was not. The woman who had sworn else had prevaricated. Phyllis's breath hitched as Victor slid the DNA report across the table, stopping elevation from Daniel's hands. Daniel didn't touch it at first. He goggled at the paper as though it might crump. His entire life replayed in fractions recollections of arguments that no way relatively made sense, of silences that dallied too long, of ganders changed when he entered a room. Suddenly, every unanswered question formed a single brutal judgment. When he eventually picked up the report, his hands quivered, but his voice remained eerily calm. He asked Victor one question: who knew? Victor answered actually only those in the room. For now. Phyllis broke also, not with denial but with despair. She spoke snappily, words tumbling over each other as she tried to frame the taradiddle as protection, as necessity, as love. She claimed she had done what any mama would do, that the verity would have destroyed Daniel, that secrets were occasionally mercy. Victor watched her without comment, but Daniel didn't. He stood, the president scraping loudly against the bottom, and asked her how numerous times she had looked him in the eye and chosen deception. Phyllis reached for him. He stepped back. The disclosure exploded still like a structural collapse, no bone. Here's until it's too late. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't charge. Rather, he withdrew, each step down from Phyllis sculpturing an unnoticeable line that could no way be crossed again. He told her that whatever man had contributed to his DNA signified lower than the woman who had stolen his verity. Phyllis tried to follow him, contending, explaining, rewriting history in real time, but Victor interposed, not out of kindness to her but respect for Daniel. This was Daniel's reckoning, not hers. News in Genoa City no way stays contained. By evening, the fallout had spread through rumored phone calls and guarded aesthetics. Alliances shifted as people recalculated commitment, doubtful whether to console Phyllis or condemn her. Victor issued no public statement. He no way did when verity spoke louder than press releases. Rather, he watched as consequences unfolded organically, knowing that forced issues frequently bred rebellion. Daniel retreated from public view, cutting ties, ignoring calls, and dismembering the precisely balanced life he'd erected. He questioned everything: his choices, his instincts, his recollections, wondering how important of himself was real, and how important had been scripted by someone differently's fear. Phyllis, meanwhile, entwined. The bravado dissolved, replaced by raw fear. She justified, she accounted, she criticized Victor for hindrance, fate for atrocity, and herself for nothing at all. Yet alone, stripped of followership, guilt strained through the cracks. She flashed back the moment she chose the taradiddle, the relief it brought, and the times it bought her. She told herself it had been worth it. Now, standing in the wreckage, that lie felt heavier than any verity she'd ever carried. Victor's part didn't end with disclosure. He understood that verity without direction could be as destructive as deception. He offered Daniel Coffer's counselors, investigators, time. Daniel refused utmost of it. What he wanted was space, not results. Victor admired that. But he also assured one thing: Phyllis would not control the narrative. Lies thrived in nebulosity, and Victor Newman didn't business in nebulosity. Days turned into weeks, and the damage proved endless. Daniel returned, but changed. More guarded, less trusting, bent in boundaries he'd no way demanded ahead. His relationship with Phyllis came transactional at best, civil at worst. There was no screaming conciliation, no tearful remission. There was only distance. Phyllis learned the hardest assignment of her life: that love erected on falsehoods ultimately collapses under its own weight, and some remains cannot be rebuilt. The days following Victor Newman's disclosure didn't arrive with thunder or spectacle. Rather, they came still, like the pang that sets into broken bones once the adrenaline fades. Genoa City had seen dishonors before, affairs, apprehensions, deaths that no way relatively stayed endless, but this was different. This wasn't a caption moment. It was a slow corrosion of trust that strained into exchanges, ganders, and silences. The kind of verity that didn't scream but dallied. Daniel Romalotti faded from his usual routines. He stopped answering calls, canceled meetings, and retreated into an interpretation of insulation he hadn't known since his most reckless times. The garret that formerly felt like a sanctuary now felt like a gallery of someone differently's life. Every snap, every half-finished design mocked him with the same question: who was he really? He replayed recollections obsessively. Arguments that sounded too vague, moments where explanations felt rehearsed, times when his mama's affection framed on despair. The consummation settled sluggishly but forcefully. The taradiddle hadn't just changed one fact about his life. It had altered the foundation beneath everything he believed. Meanwhile, Phyllis Summers moved through Genoa City like a ghost who refused to admit she was dead. She overcompensated intimately, too loud, too sharp, too quick with a smile, while intimately unraveling in fractions. She told herself she had survived worse. She reminded herself of every treason she'd endured, every blameworthiness she'd fought off. But this time there was no adversary to condemn, no rival to outmaneuver. The villain for formerly was her own choice. At night, when the megacity quieted, Phyllis replayed the moment she had decided to lie. She flashed back the fear vividly, the certainty that the verity would bring her everything. She had believed that love justified silence, that fatherhood meant choosing stability over honesty. For times, that belief had defended her. Now, it felt like a captivity judgment eventually being executed. Daniel's absence was louder than any blameworthiness. His silence carried further weight than wrathfulness ever could. Victor Newman, as always, stood at the center without appearing to. Victor Newman didn't follow up with demands or lectures. He understood that consequences were most effective when allowed to unfold naturally. Yet indeed in restraint, his presence impended. People spoke his name in lowered voices, not out of fear but recognition. Victor hadn't created the taradiddle, but he'd ended it. In Genoa City, that distinction signified. The ripple goods extended beyond mama and son. Old alliances strained as musketeers chose sides. Doubtful whether support for Phyllis inferred countersign of her deception. Some argued that her intentions softened the treason. Others claimed that intention meant nothing when autonomy had been stolen. Exchanges ended suddenly. Assignations were still rescinded. Phyllis felt the social temperature drop around her. The megacity's judgment expressed not through battle, but rejection. Daniel ultimately resurfaced, though not in the way anyone anticipated. He didn't storm into Newman Enterprises or defy Victor again. Rather, he sought answers that had nothing to do with vengeance. He met with Croakers, inheritable counselors and therapists, not because he was broken but because he refused to stay confused. He wanted data stripped of emotion, data untouched by fidelity. The process was clinical, exhausting, and deeply particular. Each session hulled down another subcast of the identity he allowed. He understood. One autumn, Daniel set up himself standing outdoors his mama's door without flashing back the walk there. The instinct surprised him. He didn't knock. He didn't leave. He stood still, hearkening to the muffled sounds inside. Movement, breathing, life continuing despite the fracture between them. In that moment, he realized the verity wasn't that he abominated Phyllis. It was worse. He no longer trusted her to define his reality. And without trust, love came commodity, fragile and distant. When they eventually spoke again, it wasn't the reunion Phyllis had imagined during insomniac nights. There were no gashes of remission, no dramatic affirmations. Daniel spoke plainly, his voice steady but detached. He told her he demanded time, not to heal, but to rebuild himself singly of her interpretation of events. He explained that the taradiddle had burgled him of choice, and until he learned how to make choices for himself again, their relationship would remain limited. Phyllis jounced, accepting the boundary because she had no right to argue it. For the first time, she heeded without interposing, without defending. It was the least she could do. Victor observed these developments from a distance, apprehensive that his involvement had shifted him from power broker to silent substantiation. He'd been indicted still and loudly of atrocity, manipulation, and opportunism. None of it surprised him. What surprised others was his turndown to subsidize on the fallout. He didn't use Daniel's vulnerability as influence. He didn't cheapen Phyllis intimately. He'd achieved his objective verity restored. Anything beyond that was indulgence, and Victor Newman didn't indulge without purpose. Yet Victor wasn't untouched by the consequences. The disclosure stirred old recollections, choices he'd made in the name of family, secrets he'd justified as protection. Watching Daniel struggle forced him to defy uncomfortable parallels. Victor had always believed strength meant control. This situation suggested else. Strength maybe was knowing when control ended and honesty began. As weeks passed, Genoa City acclimated to its new normal. The shock faded, replaced by a conservative mindfulness that some injuries didn't close neatly. Daniel began rebuilding his life on his own terms. He pursued work that felt meaningful rather than familiar, reseated himself from inherited prospects, and learned to ask questions without stewing the answers. The process was slow, uneven, but authentic. For the first time, his future felt verbal. Phyllis, meanwhile, faced the hardest reckoning of her life, not public disgrace, but private responsibility. She sought remedy, not to justify her choices, but to understand them. She brazened patterns she had ignored for time's fear of abandonment, need for control, belief that love needed manipulation. The sessions were brutal. There were days she left furious, induced the world was illegal. There were others she left shattered, forced to accept that good intentions didn't abolish detriment. Their relationship didn't end. It converted into commodity, quieter, more conservative. Mother and son spoke, but precisely. They participated moments but not hypotheticals. Trust, formerly broken, didn't return through grand gestures. It rebuilt itself through thickness, honesty, and tolerance. Rates Phyllis had infrequently rehearsed but now clung to desperately. Victor Newman watched all of this with measured reflection. He knew Genoa City would flash back this moment not as a reproach, but as a turning point. Falsehoods had been exposed, yes, but more importantly, choices had been readdressed. The DNA stunner didn't simply alter lineage. It challenged the megacity's implied rule that secrets were currency. Some secrets, Victor had proven, were arrears staying to crump. Daniel Romalotti began to understand that grief didn't arrive all at formerly. It came in swells, quiet mornings when he forgot what had changed, followed by unforeseen moments when the weight of it pressed down so hard he could slightly breathe. He suffered the father he allowed. He knew the certainty he'd reckoned on, and the interpretation of his mama who, in his memory, had been unable of such a treason. Yet the strangest grief of all was for the life he might have lived had he known the verity sooner. That loss had no face, no timeline, only a patient pang. He threw himself into work, not out of ambition, but as an anchor. Systems gave him deadlines, structure, commodity solid in a world that felt recently unreliable. But indeed there, he noticed the difference. He questioned opinions more, second-guessed instincts that formerly felt natural. Trust, he realized, wasn't just commodity you gave to people, it was commodity you gave to yourself. And his trust in his own comprehensions had been shaken. Phyllis Summers, on the other hand, plodded with stillness. For someone who had always survived through stir, schemes, strategies, constant engagement, being forced to sit with her choices felt unsupportable. She tried to busy herself, to fit herself into exchanges, to reclaim applicability, but the megacity responded else now. Where once her intensity had been permitted, indeed respected, it now felt protrusive. People heeded less. They watched more. At home the silence was blaring. Phyllis set up herself talking audibly just to fill it, rehearsing exchanges that might no way be. She rehearsed justifications, not for effect but for delicacy. Each attempt stripped down another subcast of tone deception. She had told herself the taradiddle was temporary. She had told herself she'd tell the verity one day. Times had passed and that day no way came. Facing that reality hurt more than Victor's intervention ever could. Victor Newman, ever the mastermind of consequence, remained intimately detached yet intimately reflective. Victor Newman understood power better than anyone in Genoa City, and he also understood its limits. He'd exposed the taradiddle because it hovered the integrity of families tied to his own. But watching the fate forced him to defy a verity he infrequently conceded indeed justified conduct carried contributory damage. Victor observed Daniel with an admixture of respect and remorse. He saw a man stripped of vision yet refusing to collapse under it. That adaptability reverberated with Victor more than he admitted. In Daniel's quiet determination, Victor honored commodity familiar. Strength forged not through dominance but abidance. It was a memorial that heritage wasn't just about pedigrees or conglomerates, but about what survived when certainty was taken down. The megacity's response evolved sluggishly. Original shock gave way to discussion, also to interpretation. Some viewed Phyllis as a woeful figure, undone by fear and love. Others saw her as an exemplary tale, evidence that control masquerading as care inescapably failed. The debate itself came part of Genoa City's meter, woven into coffee shop exchanges and late-night reflections. No agreement surfaced, and maybe that was the point. Truth complicated effects. It always did. Daniel's trip toward tone description took an unanticipated turn when he began exploring his history with new eyes. Not searching for a natural father, that answer signified lower than he'd formerly believed, but redefining the choices he'd made, believing he was someone additional's son. He questioned which corridor of his life were responses to prospects he hadn't chosen. That soul-searching was painful but liberating. For the first time, he felt free to decide who he was without inherited narratives importing him down. His relations with Phyllis came measured, nearly formal. There were moments of genuine connection, participated recollections, quiet horse laugh, but they were fragile, erected on caution. Phyllis accepted this, indeed, when it hurt. She understood now that remission wasn't owed. It was earned, and indeed also, it might no way completely arrive. Her part as a mama had shifted. She could no longer define Daniel's reality. She could only live actually within it. Victor's influence subtly reshaped commercial and particular geographies likewise. Without ever mentioning the DNA disclosure again, he corroborated a culture of translucency in spaces where secretiveness had formerly been currency. Contracts came clearer. Hypotheticals were questioned. People tasted the shift, indeed if they couldn't articulate it. Victor hadn't just exposed a taradiddle. He had changed the rules by which power operated, at least for a time. As months passed, the story no longer felt like a reproach. Came history, one that still told present opinions. Daniel stood stronger, quieter, more predicated. Phyllis stood humbler, more reflective, sorrowfully apprehensive of the cost of her choices. Victor stood unchanged in presence, but subtly altered in perspective. Genoa City endured as it always did, shaped by the trueness it survived. The DNA stunner faded from captions, but its impact remained etched into the megacity's emotional armature. Connections were rebuilt else now. Love came with further questions. Trust came slower. And beneath it all dallied a participated understanding that verity, formerly revealed, could be undone, but it could review everything that followed.